April 29, 1945, Dachau, Bavaria. The morning air is cold and still. Low clouds hang over the flat fields north of Munich, muting sound, dulling color. U.S. Army vehicles move cautiously along a narrow road lined with bare trees and damaged fences. The soldiers expect resistance, snipers, mines, a last, pointless fight from a collapsing Reich. Instead, they smell it first, a heavy, sour odor that does not belong to a battlefield. Just beyond the road, a railway spur comes into view. Brown freight cars sit motionless on the tracks, their doors thrown open. Inside are bodies stacked, unmoving, unnamed. Men in American uniforms stop walking, no one speaks. Ahead, a guarded compound rises behind concrete walls and barbed wire. A sign hangs over the gate. The name means nothing to the soldiers yet. They step forward not as liberators, not as victors, but as witnesses crossing a threshold history will never close again. What they are about to see will follow them long after the war ends, reshaping how they understand Germany, the enemy, and themselves. And as the gates of Dachau come into full view, the wider collapse of Nazi Germany suddenly takes on a far darker meaning. The war that led them to Dachau by late April 1945, the war in Europe, was no longer balanced on uncertainty. It was collapsing, unevenly, violently, and without dignity. The Western Front had broken open weeks earlier. On March 7, American forces seized the Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen, crossing the Rhine sooner than German planners believed possible. From that moment on, the German heartland lay exposed. Allied armies surged east and south, bypassing isolated pockets of resistance, advancing faster than maps could be updated. In southern Germany, the US 7th Army pushed through Bavaria. Its units, battle-hardened from Normandy, southern France, and the Vosges, were no longer fighting for terrain alone. They were racing against time. Intelligence reports warned that prisoners, infrastructure, and evidence were being destroyed as the Reich unraveled. Adolf Hitler remained in Berlin, issuing orders to armies that no longer existed. German command structures fractured, communications failed, rail lines were bombed into uselessness. Civilian refugees clogged roads once reserved for military convoys. In many areas, SS units operated independently, answering to ideology rather than strategy. The Americans advancing toward Munich did not yet know what lay ahead. Their briefings focused on expected military threats, rearguard actions, sabotage, booby traps. Bavaria still housed important industrial facilities and was believed to contain pockets of fanatical resistance. Dachau itself appeared on maps only as a town, a minor rail junction, and an SS training area. What the soldiers did know was that they were entering the final chapter of the war. They had seen death before, on beaches, in hedgerows, in forests shattered by artillery. They had liberated towns, encountered displaced civilians, and uncovered small prison compounds holding forced laborers. These discoveries were grim, but still comprehensible within the brutal logic of war. Nothing had prepared them for scale. As American columns moved south of the Danube, reports filtered in from the east. Soviet forces had liberated camps in Poland months earlier, Majdanek, Auschwitz, but the full details had not yet reached frontline units in the West. What information existed was fragmented, filtered through intelligence summaries and cautious wording. Even senior officers struggled to grasp what concentration camp truly meant in practice. To most US soldiers, the term suggested imprisonment, brutality, starvation, not an entire system engineered for degradation and death. On April 28, elements of the 45th Infantry Division and the 42nd Rainbow Division received orders to secure areas northwest of Munich. Their objectives were practical: clear roads, secure bridges, accept surrenders, maintain momentum. No mention was made of a camp holding tens of thousands of prisoners. German resistance in the area was inconsistent. Some units surrendered immediately, others fired sporadically, then disappeared. SS formations were more unpredictable, sometimes fleeing, sometimes fighting, sometimes abandoning posts without explanation. The normal patterns of combat were dissolving. By the early hours of April 29, American troops approached a walled complex near the town of Dachau. They noticed rail lines leading directly inside, guard towers, barbed wire. A layout that did not resemble a factory or a barracks. Still, their mindset remained military: secure the perimeter, neutralize threats, move on. They could not yet know that this location was not a battlefield objective, but a moral fault line, one that would permanently alter how the war was understood, not just by those who fought it, but by the world that came after. To understand why this discovery mattered so deeply, one must understand what Dachau had been long before the Americans arrived. What Dachau was before liberation, Dachau was not built in secrecy. It existed in full view of the German state, and in many ways it defined it. Established in March 1933, just weeks after Adolf Hitler became Chancellor, Dachau was the first permanent concentration camp created by the Nazi regime. It was designed not merely to imprison enemies, but to demonstrate power. Its original purpose was political, to break communists, social democrats, trade unionists, and anyone considered a threat to Nazi control. The camp was constructed on the grounds of a former munitions factory outside the town of Dachau, approximately 10 miles northwest of Munich. From the beginning, it operated under the authority of the SS, not the civilian justice system. This distinction mattered. It meant detainees existed outside normal legal protection, subject only to internal camp rules enforced through violence. Over time, Dachau became more than a prison, it became a model. The SS used Dachau as a training ground for camp guards, exporting its systems, discipline methods, punishment protocols, administrative structures, to camps across German-occupied Europe. Procedures refined here would later appear at Buchenwald, Sachsenhausen, and beyond. In this sense, Dachau was not peripheral to Nazi crimes, it was foundational. By the late 1930s, the prisoner population expanded. Jews, Roma, Jehovah's Witnesses, clergy, homosexuals, and so-called asocials were added to the rolls. After the outbreak of war, prisoners from occupied countries arrived in increasing numbers: Poles, French, Soviets, Yugoslavs. Many were brought for forced labor, others for resistance. Some simply disappeared into the system without explanation. The camp's structure reflected its purpose. Rows of wooden barracks lined a central roll call square, designed for mass assemblies regardless of weather. Guard towers overlooked every angle. Barbed wire fencing was electrified. Discipline was enforced through exhaustion, starvation, and routine brutality. Disease spread easily. Medical experiments were conducted under SS supervision, often without anesthesia, often without survival. By 1944, Dachau had become the hub of an expanding network. More than 30 satellite camps surrounded it, feeding labor to armaments factories, construction projects, and military infrastructure. Prisoners were worked until collapse, then replaced. Mortality rates climbed as food supplies dwindled and Allied bombing disrupted logistics. As Germany's military situation worsened, conditions inside Dachau deteriorated rapidly. Evacuations from camps in the east brought thousands more prisoners westward in forced marches and overcrowded transports. Many arrived already dying, barracks overflowed, sanitation systems failed. Typhus spread uncontrollably. The SS no longer maintained even the pretense of order. Commanders received contradictory instructions: destroy evidence, move prisoners, continue production. Guards abandoned posts, records were burned, some prisoners were executed, others were left to starve. Yet Dachau continued to operate until the final days. Not because it was militarily necessary, but because it had become embedded in the regime's identity. Shutting it down would have meant admitting what it truly was. When American forces approached in April 1945, over 30,000 prisoners remained inside. Many were too weak to stand, thousands were already dead. Railcars sat on sidings filled with corpses from recent transports, men who had not survived the final journey. None of this was known to the soldiers advancing toward the gates. They did not know Dachau's history, its role as a prototype, or its place in the architecture of terror. They only saw walls, wires, and watchtowers, features they had learned to associate with military installations. What they were about to encounter would not just reveal the truth about Dachau. It would force them to confront the moral reality of the war they thought they already understood, and that confrontation began the moment they stepped inside. The first American soldiers through the outer perimeter did not react immediately. Training held them in place, weapons stayed raised, eyes scanned for threats, then the silence broke. Prisoners emerged slowly from the barracks, figures in striped uniforms, skeletal, uncertain whether the men approaching were real or imagined. Some tried to speak, others simply stared. A few collapsed where they stood. The soldiers had seen hunger before, they had seen wounded civilians, but this was different, bodies reduced beyond recognition. Faces that carried fear without language. Many soldiers later described an overwhelming stillness inside themselves. Anger did not come first, shock did. They moved forward carefully, not wanting to frighten the prisoners, unsure how to help. Some offered cigarettes. Others gave rations, not yet realizing how dangerous rich food could be for starved bodies. Medics were called. Officers tried to impose order, but emotion pressed in from every direction. The war had trained these men to kill efficiently. Dachau demanded something else entirely. Even in that moment, the battlefield mindset did not vanish. The camp had to be secured. American units fanned out, clearing guard towers, checking buildings, searching for armed SS personnel. Some guards surrendered immediately, others attempted to blend in. Weapons were confiscated. Prisoners were told to stay inside the wire for their own safety. Disease was an immediate concern. Reports moved quickly up the chain of command. This was not a POW camp. This was something unprecedented in the Western Front. The presence of railcars filled with bodies outside the camp shifted priorities. The discovery was no longer local, it was evidentiary. Photographers were summoned, documentation began, orders were issued to preserve the site. Combat operations paused here, not because the war had stopped, but because something demanded to be recorded before it could be erased. For the SS guards who remained, the moment arrived without ceremony. No speeches, no defenses, some stood frozen, others dropped their weapons, a few attempted to flee and were captured. Their authority dissolved instantly. The uniforms that had granted them absolute power inside the camp meant nothing now. They had enforced Dachau through fear. Now they faced men who had crossed Europe to destroy the system that protected them. The guards' reactions were marked not by defiance, but by disbelief. The war had ended for them not with orders, but with exposure. As these first perspectives collided, shock, security, surrender, the Americans realized that entering Dachau was not the end of a mission. It was the beginning of a reckoning that would unfold across many layers at once. Inside Dachau, the rules of war blurred. The Geneva Conventions had prepared soldiers for prisoners of war, not for what they found here. American troops confronted men who had overseen systematic cruelty. Guards who had beaten, starved, and selected prisoners for death now stood unarmed, stripped of authority. Rage moved just beneath the surface. Many soldiers later admitted that restraint, not violence, required the greater effort. Officers reminded their men that Dachau was now evidence. Justice would not be improvised in the moment. It would be deliberate, recorded, and public. This insistence on control did not erase emotion. It contained it barely. The presence of prisoners watching silently heightened the tension. For them, the arrival of American soldiers represented survival. For the guards, it meant accountability. The moral weight of the moment pressed on everyone, shaping decisions that would be debated long after the gates closed behind them. Command responsibility shifted instantly. Junior officers found themselves managing tens of thousands of civilians in catastrophic condition. Medical officers confronted diseases they had never treated at such scale. Logistics units were ordered to divert supplies intended for frontline combat. Decisions had to be made without precedent: how to feed the starving without killing them, how to isolate the sick without abandoning them, how to maintain discipline among soldiers pushed to emotional limits. Leadership at Dachau was not about tactics. It was about restraint, documentation, and care. These decisions transformed the American role from conquerors to custodians, temporary stewards of lives broken by a system now exposed. Perhaps the most lasting angle was the simplest. The Americans had seen it. Photographers documented every structure, every body, every face. Written reports described conditions in precise, unemotional language. Officers understood that disbelief would follow, proof would be required. The soldiers themselves became witnesses, whether they wanted the role or not. What they carried out of Dachau could not be set down with their equipment. Many would struggle to describe it to families back home. Others would never speak of it at all. Dachau transformed from a hidden institution into a historical fact the moment Americans entered it. And with that transformation came a turning point, not only for those inside the camp but for the war itself. The liberation was no longer just a military success, it was an irreversible revelation. The moment the gates were opened, the gates of Dachau did not fall in battle. They stood open, unattended, as American soldiers moved inside. What confronted them defied immediate comprehension. The camp unfolded in rigid lines, barracks aligned with mechanical precision, pathways worn into the earth by endless forced marches. Guard towers looming over a population too weak to fear them anymore. The geometry of control remained intact, even as the system behind it had collapsed. Inside the main compound, prisoners gathered cautiously, some saluted, others wept, many did neither. They watched in silence, unsure whether this moment would last. Liberation, to men who had learned not to hope, required proof. The Americans advanced deeper. They entered barracks where wooden bunks were stacked 3 high, bodies pressed together for warmth. The air was thick with sickness, lice, decay. The smell that had followed them from the rail line now permeated everything. Outside the camp perimeter, the railcars confirmed what the barracks suggested. Dozens of freight wagons stood on the tracks, each filled with corpses. Prisoners evacuated from other camps had been transporting here in the final days of the war, without food, without water, without regard for survival. Many had died before the train ever stopped. Soldiers stood beside the cars, counting without realizing they were counting. This was not collateral damage, this was policy. Word spread rapidly through the American units. Officers halted further movement, guards were rounded up, medical personnel were summoned urgently. The war paused here not because the enemy had surrendered, but because reality demanded attention. At this moment, Dachau ceased to be a place of rumor or abstraction. It became evidence. And as American commanders absorbed the full scope of what had been discovered, the realization set in that this was not simply another liberated site. This was a turning point, one that would change how the war would be remembered, prosecuted, and judged, because from this point forward there could be no claim of ignorance. When exposure became permanent as the day progressed, control replaced shock, not because the horror lessened, but because it had to be faced methodically. American officers ordered the camp sealed. No one was allowed to leave, not prisoners, not guards, until the situation could be stabilized. Medical teams established triage zones, engineers assessed water and sanitation systems. Interpreters attempted to identify prisoner nationalities, languages, and urgent needs. Inside the barracks, the reality deepened with every step. Men lay motionless on bunks, alive but beyond response. Others whispered names, family members, towns, fragments of memory, clinging to identity after years of erasure. Some prisoners tried to help the Americans understand what they were seeing, pointing to crematoria, punishment cells, execution walls. The crematorium complex confirmed what the railcars had implied. Furnaces stood cold, but recent use was unmistakable. Ash residue, tools, records hastily abandoned. There was no longer any ambiguity about purpose or scale. For the American command, this discovery altered priorities beyond Dachau. Orders were transmitted to higher headquarters. Allied leadership was informed that concentration camps in the western zones were not marginal sites, but central instruments of Nazi policy. Instructions followed: preserve everything. Photograph everything, write everything down. The war was still ongoing. Firing could be heard in the distance, but for those inside Dachau, the conflict had shifted. Victory was no longer measured in territory gained, but in truth exposed. German guards, once absolute within these walls, now stood under watch. They avoided eye contact. They offered no explanations. Their silence spoke more clearly than any defense. For the prisoners, liberation did not arrive all at once. Freedom was complicated by weakness, disease, and grief. Some would not survive the days that followed, but the system that had defined their existence had ended permanently. Dachau could never return to secrecy. The presence of American soldiers, cameras, and medical units made that impossible. The camp was no longer an isolated institution, it was a documented crime scene. And as the final days of the war unfolded across Germany, the consequences of what was found at Dachau began to spread outward, shaping not only immediate relief efforts, but the moral reckoning that would follow victory. The first hours and days after Dachau's gates were opened were defined by urgency. American medics moved among the prisoners, carrying water, bread, and blankets. Field hospitals were set up outside the compound. Soldiers used their vehicles to transport the sick and injured to nearby towns where care could be provided. Corpses were collected from the railcars and barracks, each one documented carefully. Photographers, official war correspondents, and Army Signal Corps personnel captured images that would later become central evidence in war crimes trials. Soldiers and officers meticulously recorded names, numbers, and nationalities, aware that these records might be all that survived for some victims. The American units faced enormous logistical challenges. Tens of thousands of prisoners required immediate food and medical care. Typhus and dysentery threatened to spread rapidly. Those too weak to move were carried on stretchers or makeshift litters. Field kitchens ran continuously. Supplies intended for frontline troops were diverted to save lives. Security remained a concern. SS guards still held knowledge of the camp layout and its hidden resources. They were confined under strict supervision. Attempts at escape were minimal. Guards were stunned, demoralized, and often confused, realizing that their authority had vanished entirely. Meanwhile, word spread through the surrounding areas. Local German civilians arrived at the perimeter, curious or fearful, to see what lay behind the walls. Many could not comprehend what had been hidden for years. The presence of American forces enforced both observation and order. Civilians were not allowed to interfere. The scale of human suffering at Dachau shocked even seasoned soldiers. Many men who had fought across Europe described later how they were unprepared for the combination of starvation, disease, and visible death in one location. The experience left lasting psychological scars. Officers emphasized restraint, caution, and documentation, but the emotional burden was immediate and heavy. Dachau became more than a military objective, it became a humanitarian responsibility. Soldiers, medics, and officers worked continuously to stabilize the camp while maintaining control over tens of thousands of prisoners. Every decision carried moral weight, from who received the first medical attention to how the dead were respectfully handled. The liberation of Dachau reverberated far beyond the camp's walls. For the US forces, it became a defining moral moment of the European campaign. Soldiers who had faced combat for years now confronted the systematic cruelty of a regime in its final days. Many described a mixture of relief, anger, and disbelief. Combat training offered no preparation for witnessing a mechanized system of human destruction firsthand. Strategically, the camp's exposure sent an immediate signal to German forces. News of Dachau's liberation traveled quickly along military and civilian channels. SS units in the surrounding region realized that their authority was gone, not only at Dachau but across Bavaria. Attempts to organize resistance in the final days were undermined by the awareness that evidence of atrocities could now be presented to the Allies. The presence of American documentation teams made further concealment impossible. For German civilians, Dachau challenged perception. Many had been sheltered from the reality of camps, either by propaganda or fear. Seeing the evidence, barbed wire crematoria emaciated prisoners, confronted them with questions of complicity, ignorance, and survival. Some local administrators attempted to distance themselves from the camp's operations. Others were forced to acknowledge their proximity to mass atrocities. Psychologically, the liberation had a profound impact on US soldiers. Troops wrote letters home, kept journals, and recorded their impressions in official reports. The emotional strain of witnessing concentrated suffering, alongside the challenge of maintaining discipline, left an indelible mark. Officers noted the difficulty of preventing retaliatory violence against surrendering SS personnel. The expectation of moral restraint became as crucial as tactical judgment. The aftermath of Dachau also shaped the early stages of war crimes documentation and post-war justice. Photographs, testimonies, and official reports gathered by the Americans were later used in Nuremberg trials and other proceedings. Dachau became a reference point for understanding the scale of Nazi crimes, demonstrating the need for international accountability. In this sense, the camp's liberation was more than a military achievement. It transformed from an isolated episode into a precedent for how humanity confronted systematic brutality. The operational lessons, medical care, logistics, security, were inseparable from the moral lessons. The soldiers who entered Dachau carried both forward into the closing days of the war, ensuring that what they saw could not be forgotten or dismissed. Dachau was never just a location on a map. It was a moral landscape, revealed in full only to those who crossed its threshold. For the American soldiers who entered, liberation was not triumph, it was witness. They saw what organization, ideology, and cruelty could produce when combined without restraint. The camp forced a confrontation with the darkest capacities of human systems. Yet it also revealed another truth, that courage, discipline, and compassion could endure even in the shadow of horror. Medics treated the sick. Soldiers offered comfort where they could. Leaders insisted on order and documentation. These acts did not erase suffering, but they preserved humanity amid devastation. Dachau's exposure shaped history. The photographs, records, and testimonies collected by US forces became enduring evidence, shaping war crimes trials and the collective understanding of the Holocaust. For soldiers, it became a lifelong imprint, a reminder that victory in war cannot be measured only in territory or enemy casualties, but also in the moral reckoning it produces. In the end, Dachau stands as a testament to both the depths of cruelty and the responsibility borne by those who survived to see, remember, and record. The men who entered that morning in April 1945 carried not only rifles and uniforms, but the obligation to witness history. And through their careful documentation, the world learned what had been hidden for too long. The camp gates may have opened that day, but the truth they revealed could never be closed.